All right, let's talk about something most of us have known since we were kids, the Pledge of Allegiance. It feels like this fundamental, unchangeable piece of American life, right? But believe it or not, there's a really surprising story hiding inside those familiar words.
Yeah, those words, they're iconic. So many of us can recite them without even thinking. They feel so permanent, almost like they were carved in stone by the founding fathers. But here's the thing. One part of that pledge is way younger than you probably think. So, that's the big question, isn't it? That phrase, under God. Has it always been there? I mean, if you had to take a wild guess, what year would you pick? Sometime in the 1700s? Maybe 1892 when the pledge was first written?
No, the answer is 1954. Seriously, for the first 62 years it existed, the Pledge of Allegiance didn't mention God at all. That phrase wasn't from the Revolutionary era, it was born out of a very specific and very anxious moment in American history.
So, to really get why this change happened, we have to jump in our mental time machine and go back to the Cold War. The fight against the Soviet Union, well, it wasn't just about spies and missiles. It was framed as this huge moral and spiritual war.
And this quote right here, from Senator Joseph McCarthy back in 1950, it lays it all out, plain and simple. He basically boiled down the entire global conflict to one thing: a Christian West versus an atheist East. In his eyes, this wasn't just politics, it was a battle for the soul of the world.
And this idea wasn't just in politics, oh no. It was everywhere. It completely saturated pop culture. You'd see it on TV shows, where Russian characters would just scoff at the idea of religion. There were movies where a kid not wanting to go to church was a huge red flag that he was becoming a communist. Even comic books got in on it, painting communists as these villains who literally burned Bibles. The message couldn't have been clearer. The enemy was, first and foremost, godless.
So, with all this anxiety bubbling up in the culture, it was only a matter of time before it became a political movement. And that's where the Knights of Columbus come in. They're a Catholic fraternal group, and they really felt that threat of godless communism. So in 1952, they started a campaign, formally petitioning the government to add the words "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance.
And this idea climbed the ladder of power, fast. We're talking all the way to the top. The president's own pastor, Reverend George Dougherty, gave this incredibly powerful sermon. And guess who was sitting in the pews? President Eisenhower himself. The Reverend argued that leaving God out of the pledge meant leaving out the very core of what America was all about.
And, this change to the pledge, it didn't happen in a vacuum. Not at all. It was part of this rapid-fire series of changes. In April '54, you see "In God We Trust" on postage stamps for the very first time. Just 2 months later, boom, "Under God" is in the pledge. And then by 1956, "In God We Trust" is the official national motto. This was a very deliberate effort.
And President Eisenhower, his own words really say it all. He called these changes a way of strengthening America's spiritual weapons. In the Cold War fight, faith wasn't just a private matter. It was seen as a tool, a resource for national security. Okay, so that's the why from a historical standpoint. But what that moment left us with is, well, it's complicated. It's led to two very different ways of looking at that little phrase, "under God."
The official story, the one they sold to the public back in the 50s, was all about unity and defense. They framed it as this simple, powerful way to announce our religious traditions to the world and to build, a bulwark against communism. It was about drawing a moral line in the sand.
But there's another way to look at it, one that comes from a more critical perspective. On the one hand, you have that spiritual defense idea. This unifies us. It reaffirms who we are. But on the other hand, there's this concept of theist normative containment, a fancy term for the idea that it was really about promoting one specific worldview, pushing aside atheists and secular folks, and basically making belief in God a requirement for being a good citizen.
So let's break down that term, theist normativity. It sounds complicated, but the idea is actually pretty simple. It's when a society just assumes that believing in God is the default, the norm. It's the idea that connects having faith with being a good, moral, trustworthy citizen.
And if you think that's just some modern academic take, listen to the language they were actually using back then. This quote from one of the people who pushed for the change is just, wow. He said that an atheist American is a contradiction in terms. The message was that being American meant you believed in God. Being an atheist was, by definition, un-American. This was about defining who was really part of the club.
And that history right there is exactly why this isn't just a dusty old fact. This phrase, added almost 70 years ago, is still at the heart of so many arguments today about American identity, about religion, and about who really gets to belong.
So let's just quickly recap the big points. The phrase, under God, it's not original. It was a Cold War addition in 1954. It was born out of the fear of godless communism, and its supporters saw it as a spiritual weapon. But critics argue it turned the pledge into a ritual that pushes non-believers to the margins. And honestly, you can't really understand today's debates about church and state without knowing this history.
Which kind of leaves us with this huge question, right? The story of the Pledge of Allegiance proves that national symbols aren't set in stone. They can change and evolve based on the fears and hopes of a particular era. And it makes you wonder, how does a country's identity get shaped? And more importantly, who gets to decide what it stands for?